When Henderson Scott married Margaret Clark Glass in June of 1849, it took almost a month for the occasion to be noted in the Raleigh, North Carolina Standard. News did not travel fast in those days. Henderson was a farmer and a businessman who lived in Alamance County, North Carolina. His general store was strategically located to garner as much business as possible, and to this venture he would soon add a blacksmith shop and a tannery. At that time, Margaret was a 27-year-old widow and already the mother of a lively young daughter. It is not hard to imagine the new couple driving home from the wedding only to stop at a field across from Henderson's store. There they decided they would build a sturdy new home for their family. This house, pictured here, still stands today. It was home to 6 generations of Scots. Before the coming of the railroad, Henderson and his neighbors were forced to be as self-sufficient as possible. Roads were not paved, and the major centers of commerce were miles away, making travel to market time-consuming and expensive. Things changed dramatically when the railroad came to town in the 1850s. People moved to be closer to the new depots, and the towns that would become Haw River, Burlington, and Mebane started to constellate around the newcomers. After the railroad connected the Hawfields to larger commercial centers, Henderson joined with 3 local businessmen to start a second general store and a tobacco warehouse in nearby Mebansville, a precursor to modern-day Mebane. He and his family survived the ravages of the Civil War by making shoes and other leather goods for the Confederate Army. Henderson's enterprising spirit would most likely have resulted in even more ventures, but he died suddenly in 1870 after surgery on an injured ankle. Margaret and her oldest son Samuel were left to manage the family businesses and to raise the younger children. It soon became apparent that Henderson and Margaret's sons all inherited their father's zeal for business. All 3, Sam, James Edwin, and Robert, would go on to start businesses of their own. Sam bought a property near the new depot in Mebansville from some of his father's old business partners. The building must have been well made, as it survived until 1973, when it was demolished to make way for a bank. From letters written to his brothers, we can see that Sam served as a father figure to the younger Scots. Like a father, he was pleased when his brothers wrote to him from college, even though he did complain that he only heard from them when they needed money. Sam would marry twice and father 10 children. He bought and sold produce locally and shipped fruit to the vast Thurber market in New York City. Samuel died suddenly in 1897 at the age of 47. A little less than a decade later, his son Arthur Neal Scott would go into business making mattresses in the loft of Cook's Mill north of Mebane. The new company was called the Mebane Bedding Company. After several false starts, James Edwin went into business manufacturing smoking tobacco and plug tobacco. He managed the factory, while the youngest brother, Robert, became a traveling salesman for the company. In those days, traveling salesmen were referred to as drummers. Robert soon tired of being a traveling salesman and bought out his siblings' interests in the family farm. He traveled to Mountainville, New York, where he served as an apprentice at Houghton Farm. After learning all he could about modern agricultural practices, he settled down and married his childhood sweetheart, Lizzie Hughes. The couple had 14 children, 12 of whom survived to maturity. Over the next several decades, Robert and Lizzie took acres of washed-out, depleted soil and turned them into the beautiful and prosperous Millville Farm. They also created the Alamance Stock Farm, where they raised cows, sheep, horses, and pigs. Robert and Lizzie's herd of Jersey cows produced fine butter, which they sold locally. Unlike his brothers, who died far too young, Robert was able to realize his vision of helping first Alamance County and later the state of North Carolina to be a land of prosperous, live-at-home farmers. He served multiple terms in the North Carolina Assembly, always advocating for his fellow farmers, modern agricultural practices, and higher education. After Lizzie passed away in 1914, Robert remarried and a few years later retired. He distributed his land to his children, hoping that at least some of them would continue farming in the area. Many of them did, while others forged their own paths. Robert and Lizzie's oldest child, Josephine, married and settled down in Raleigh. She became a widow in 1940 and supported herself and her family by operating a very successful boarding house near the campus of North Carolina State University. Robert Walter Scott Jr., the oldest son, moved to Bolton, North Carolina, where he developed an apiary that produced 35,000 pounds of award-winning honey annually. Carr began a dairy farm on Back Creek and participated in the Guilford Dairy Cooperative. When he entered public service in a career that led to the governorship of North Carolina, followed by a seat in the United States Senate, he went home as often as he could to attend to farm business. Ralph and Henry started Melville Dairy on Henry's farm, at first processing milk produced by Henry's herd of Jersey cows. Over the next few years, they expanded by buying milk from local farmers. The dairy outgrew the small bottling plant and moved to downtown Burlington in 1935. The new state-of-the-art production facility expanded to produce bottled milk, cottage cheese, ice cream, and many other products. In the late 1940s, Melville Dairy acquired Smith Dairy from Ralph and Henry's sister Margaret and her husband Louis Smith. Trucks went back and forth from Burlington to Raleigh for several years until Melville sold Smith Melville Dairy to Longmeadow Dairies in the 1950s. Also during the 1940s, Ralph and his brother Dr. Floyd Scott, a physician, started Alamance Frozen Foods, which they later sold to their younger brother Jim, keeping the business in the family. A few years later, a new generation of Scotts would go into business for themselves. Carr Scott's son Robert worked on his father's dairy farm and took over after Carr died in 1958. Like his father, Robert entered public service, first as lieutenant governor from 1965 to 1969, and then as governor from 1969 to 1973. Henry's son Paisley White Scott followed in his father's footsteps, also becoming a farmer. He bought his first herd of dairy cows while still in college at NC State. Ralph's oldest child, Miriam, married C.W. Mayo, an executive with the Mayo Knitting Mills located in Tarboro, North Carolina. Ralph's two sons, Henderson and Bill, both worked for Melville Dairy until they developed businesses of their own. An initiative to package milk and other products in plastic containers was led by Ralph's son, Henderson Scott. It resulted in a company named Melville Plastics. Melville Dairy was also the incubator for a new business called Alamance Foods, run by Ralph's younger son, Bill Scott. In 1959, Alamance Foods became one of the first producers of an exciting new product, aerosol whipped cream. This revolutionary product catapulted Alamance Foods from a local dairy outlet to the national food manufacturer they are today. As time went by, other products were added to their production line, such as flavored drinks, freezer pops, and Triton bottled water. Bottled water is commonplace today, but when just starting out, Bill said people advised him that customers might not like the idea of paying for a drink of water. By the time the great-grandchildren of Robert and Lizzie Scott were ready to start their careers, the farming life was becoming more and more difficult to sustain. By the 1980s, an entire generation of Scotts who grew up on farms had to look around for new opportunities. In 1977, fresh out of college, Mary Scott and her husband bought an old store located right across the street from Hawfield's Presbyterian Church. Mary's, as it was called, was a gas station and a convenience store. Mary credits her father, Governor Robert Scott, for helping the business to get started. Governor Robert Scott's daughter, Meg, and her husband Rob Phipps bought the old white furniture building in downtown Mebane after the factory closed its doors. Along with Mike White, they found tenants for much of the 270,000 square foot space. The property changed hands over the years and most recently has been converted to beautiful apartments. Henry Scott's son Paisley White Scott and his wife Dorothy had 8 children. 3 of them would go on to start businesses of their own. Their eldest child, Stephen, and his wife Linda started a business which, although modest at the beginning, blossomed into what we now know as Scott Stone. Edwin and his wife Terry started a company called the TES Group. Over the years, they operated a number of businesses, at first renting equipment, and then later providing tables, chairs, and stages to events such as weddings, college graduations, and even a presidential inauguration. Steve and Edwin's sister Sarah Scott Bradley was one of the founders of Southside Storage, a multi-purpose storage facility located in Mebane, North Carolina. Andy Scott was named for his grandfather, Anderson Hughes Scott. Andy is a licensed insurance agent with State Farm. Like his grandfather, Andy is active in many local civic organizations. Edwin and Terry Scott's son, John Scott, loved to accompany his father whenever he could, learning business skills even as a small boy. John is pictured here with his great-grandfather Henry's tractor. He's a partner and manager of First Source, an equipment rental company in Mebane. John is very active on the national level and is a leader in the rental industry. Meg and Rob Phipps' son, also named Rob, is known professionally as Rob Enley. He has been passionate about music since he was a child and was recording various musical groups since he was in high school. John Scott and his cousin Rob represent the 5th generation of the descendants of Henderson and Margaret Scott. With them, we have reached the present and must bring our story to a close. Looking back over the past 175 years, it is tempting to wonder what Henderson and Margaret Scott, who married in 1849, would say about their family. Perhaps a little clue comes to us from a letter Henderson wrote in 1853 to his nephew, John Mebane Allen, who was just starting out in a new place. Here is what Henderson said.
Dear nephew, if I were in your place, I would have an eye to setting myself in some place of business. Perhaps farming someday will not be as good as it is now, and some business with farming is a good thing for a man to get along.